I was standing at my kitchen window, watching the oak tree in the backyard lose the last of its leaves, when I heard my daughter-in-law's voice drifting down the hallway. She wasn't talking to me. She never talked to me unless she needed something. She was on her phone, and she had forgotten, or perhaps didn't care, that I was still in the house. I set down my coffee mug and listened. "By spring," she said. "I'm telling you, by spring it'll all be handled." I didn't know what she meant. Not yet. "My name is Dorothy, and I am 67 years old. I have lived in this house for 31 years. I raised my son, Marcus, in this house. I painted the hallway yellow the summer he turned 8 because he said yellow was the color of happiness. I planted the rose garden along the east fence the year my husband, Gerald, passed. I have mopped these floors, repaired these windowsills, replaced every appliance in this kitchen at least once. This house is not just where I live. It is the physical record of my entire adult life. I want you to understand that before I tell you what happened, because what happened only makes sense when you know what this house means to me. Marcus married his wife, Renee, 6 years ago. I tried to love her. I genuinely did. She was sharp and confident and organized, which I admired. She could walk into a room and immediately rearrange it in her mind into something more efficient. I noticed early on that she did this with people too. She looked at you and decided what role you should play, what space you should occupy, and then she worked, quietly and persistently, to move you into that position, whether you wanted to be there or not. When they got married, I gave them a substantial gift. Gerald had left behind a life insurance policy, and for years, I had barely touched it. I gave Marcus and Renee $110,000 as a wedding gift. I didn't ask for anything in return. I didn't attach conditions. I gave it because I loved my son and I wanted them to have a strong start. Within a year, they had used it to buy a house not far from mine. I thought we would be close. I thought Sunday dinners and holiday mornings and the kind of quiet proximity that families are supposed to have. Instead, what I got was distance with a warm surface. Renee called on birthdays. Marcus came by when she permitted it, which wasn't often, and when he came, he seemed slightly distracted, as if he had left something running at home and could hear it humming from here. I told myself I was being too sensitive. I told myself, this is just how young families are. They are busy. They have their own lives. This is healthy, but something in the back of my mind kept a different count. When I turned 65 and had a minor health scare, nothing serious, a dizzy spell that turned out to be a medication interaction, Renee suddenly became very attentive. She came by the house twice in 1 week. She asked detailed questions about my finances, my paperwork, whether I had a will, whether it was up to date. I answered honestly, because she was my daughter-in-law, and I assumed her concern was genuine. I had a will. It was 12 years old. It left everything to Marcus. "You should really have that updated," she said, sitting across from me at my kitchen table with a yellow notepad and a pen. She had actually brought a notepad. "Things change. Your situation has changed." I said I would look into it. She said she knew an estate attorney and could set up the appointment for me if I'd like. I thanked her, but said I preferred to handle my own affairs. She smiled and wrote something on the notepad. I didn't sleep well that night. The weeks that followed were ordinary, or they appeared to be. Marcus came for dinner on a Thursday. He seemed looser than usual, more relaxed, almost relieved about something, though I couldn't identify what. We ate and talked about small things. He helped me carry a box of old books to the storage closet and hugged me at the door before he left. I stood on the porch and watched his car until I couldn't see it anymore. A month later, Renee stopped by unannounced on a Saturday afternoon. She said she was in the neighborhood. She walked through my living room and into the kitchen and stood at the window where I had been standing that morning. The same window where I would later hear her on the phone, and she looked out at the backyard with an expression that I can only describe as evaluative. "You know," she said, without turning around, This yard is really something. All this space. I said I knew. I had lived here for 31 years. She turned and gave me the smile again. The one that went exactly as far as her mouth and no further. Have you ever thought about what you'd do with it? Down the road, I mean, when it's maybe too much to manage alone? I told her it wasn't too much to manage. Of course, she said. Right now, it's not. But you're not going to be 67 forever, Dorothy. She left 20 minutes later. She had not brought anything. She had not offered to help with anything. She had simply come to look at my house and ask me if I was thinking about leaving it. I stood in my kitchen for a long time after she drove away. That evening, I called my oldest friend, Barbara, who had known me since we were both young mothers pushing strollers around the same park. I told her about the visit. I told her about the notepad and the estate attorney and the question about the yard. Barbara was quiet for a moment. Then she said, Dorothy, listen to me carefully. Trust what you're feeling. I did not sleep well that night either. I want to tell you about a Tuesday in February, about 3 months after Renee's unannounced visit, because that Tuesday is when everything changed. I had been out in the morning, a doctor's appointment. Nothing urgent, a routine follow-up, and I came home earlier than expected. The house was empty, as it should have been. I made tea and sat down at the small desk in my bedroom where I keep my personal papers. I needed to find my insurance card to update a file. I opened the second drawer, and I immediately noticed that something was different. I am a careful and organized woman. I keep my papers in a particular order, not alphabetical, not chronological, but a system that makes sense to me, built up over decades. The folders were slightly shifted. Not drastically, just enough that someone in a hurry would not have noticed. But I noticed. I stood there, with my hand still on the drawer handle, and I counted backward through the past week, trying to think of a time I had been careless enough to leave my own papers like this. I had not. I sat down slowly and went through the drawer folder by folder. Nothing appeared to be missing, but certain papers had been handled. The will was in a slightly different position inside its envelope. My property deed, my account statements from the credit union. Someone had gone through my papers. I sat very still for a very long time. I want to tell you that I cried, or that I picked up the phone and called Marcus and demanded an explanation. But I didn't do either of those things. Something in me went very quiet and very clear, the way water goes still after a storm, and I understood with a certainty I cannot fully explain that making noise right now would be the worst thing I could do. Instead, I called Barbara. I need to think through something, I told her, and I need you to help me think clearly. We talked for 2 hours. There was only one other person who had a key to my house. Marcus had given it to Renee 2 years ago. He'd mentioned it casually, saying it was useful in case there was ever an emergency. I had accepted this without question, because what kind of mother doesn't want her son's family to be able to reach her in an emergency? What I had not accounted for was that emergency might one day mean something different to Renee than it meant to me. Barbara suggested I change the locks. I said I wasn't ready to do that. Not yet. Because if I changed the locks, whoever had come through my papers would know I knew. And I needed to understand the full picture before I showed my hand. Barbara said, "You sound like Gerald." She meant it as a compliment. I started paying closer attention to small things. Renee's phone calls became slightly more frequent over the following weeks, and they had a new quality to them, warmer, more interested, asking questions about how I was feeling, whether I was lonely, whether I had thought any more about simplifying things. That word, simplifying, began to appear in her vocabulary with a consistency that felt deliberate. Marcus came by one afternoon and mentioned, conversationally, that he and Renee had been looking into some options. "Just exploring," he said. "There are these communities now, for people in your situation, really beautiful places. You'd have everything you need. People your own age." I looked at my son. I looked at him carefully. He was not meeting my eyes in quite the way he normally did. He was looking at the wall, just past my left shoulder. "What situation is that?" I asked. "You know," he said, "living alone. It's a lot. We worry." I told him I was fine. He said, of course he knew I was fine, but things could change, and wasn't it better to plan ahead? After he left, I sat in Gerald's old armchair, and I thought about the night Marcus was born, how Gerald had held him in the hospital corridor and cried in that way men of his generation weren't supposed to cry, openly and without embarrassment. I thought about driving Marcus to school for the first time, how small his backpack looked against his thin shoulders. I thought about every ordinary Tuesday and Thursday of his entire childhood, every fever and bad dream and school play, everything I had given him that cannot be given back. And then I made a decision. I called an attorney. Not the one Renee had offered to connect me with. I found my own. Her name was Susan Hartley, and Barbara's niece had used her for a difficult divorce and said she was the kind of person who didn't waste a single word. I told Susan I needed to understand my situation completely, and I needed to understand it quickly. We met on a Thursday morning. I brought everything, the property deed, the will, the account statements, all of it. I laid it out on her desk, and I told her what I had observed over the past several months, calmly and in order, the way Gerald used to present a problem. Facts first, feelings after. Susan listened without interrupting. When I finished, she looked at me for a moment and then she said, "You were right to come in." She explained several things that I had not known, and some of them were frightening, and knowing them was one of the most important things I have ever done for myself. She told me about the ways an old will can be challenged. She told me about the ways a property deed can be transferred. She told me what certain patterns of behavior could mean from a legal standpoint. She used a phrase I had not heard before, undue influence, and she explained it carefully, and I held it in my mind like a stone that I would carry with me from that point forward. Then she told me what I could do. I want to pause here, because I know what you might be thinking. You might be thinking that I should have gone home and confronted my son. You might be thinking that none of this was certain, that perhaps I was reading too much into ordinary things, that Renee's questions were concern and not calculation. I thought about that too. I gave it real consideration. But I had gone through the drawer. I had felt how those papers were handled. I knew the difference between concern and inventory. And more than anything, I knew that if I was wrong, no harm would come from protecting myself. But if I was right and I did nothing, the harm would be irreversible. I chose to act. Over the following 3 weeks, with Susan's guidance, I made a series of quiet changes. I updated my will not to remove Marcus, but to restructure it in a way that added protections and conditions that made it extremely difficult to challenge. I placed the house in a revocable living trust with very specific terms. I opened a new account at a different credit union and moved the majority of my liquid savings there. I had new locks installed and told Marcus simply that I had found a great deal on a security upgrade and the locksmith had come by. Which was true. I had found a deal, I just hadn't mentioned the timing was deliberate. I did all of this without telling anyone except Barbara and Susan. I went about my days as I always had. I cooked, I worked in the rose garden, I called Marcus on his birthday and talked to him for 45 minutes about nothing in particular, and I waited. It was the first Tuesday of March that I was standing at the kitchen window and heard Renee's voice down the hallway. She had come by that afternoon to return a casserole dish I had sent home with Marcus 2 weeks before. She had been in the house for less than 10 minutes when her phone rang, and she stepped into the guest room to take the call. "By spring," she said. "I'm telling you, by spring, it'll all be handled." A pause. She doesn't know anything. She's been cooperative. She's actually been almost cheerful about it. Another pause. The house alone is worth just under $400, plus the accounts. Marcus isn't going to fight me on this. You know how he is. He just wants everyone to be okay. I stood very still with both hands on the edge of the counter, and I breathed. The community I found for her is actually nice. She'll be fine. And the property is already in our names once the paperwork. She stopped. I heard her say, "Hold on." And then her voice dropped, and I couldn't hear clearly anymore. I walked back to the table and sat down and poured myself a full cup of coffee from the pot that was no longer warm, and I drank it because I needed something to do with my hands. She came out of the hallway 2 minutes later, perfectly composed, and said she needed to get going, but it was so good to see me, and we should plan something for Easter. I smiled and said that sounded lovely. After she left, I sat in my kitchen for a long time. The afternoon light moved across the floor the way it does in late winter, thin and pale and patient. I thought about what she had said. The house is worth just under 400, already in our names once the paperwork. She had said once, not after. As if it were already decided. As if I were already gone. I called Susan that evening. She said, "Tell me what you heard." I told her, slowly and clearly, every word I could remember. There was a silence. Then Susan said, "The paperwork doesn't exist, Dorothy, because the house is in the trust now, and the trust cannot be transferred without your documented, witnessed, and legally verified consent. Whatever she thinks is in process, it isn't." I felt something leave my body, something I had been carrying for months without knowing how heavy it was. "What do I do now?" I asked. Susan said, "That's up to you." I thought about it for 2 days. I thought about my son and whether he knew the full extent of what Renee had been planning, and I decided that I did not know, and that not knowing was important. Marcus had always been a person who wanted peace more than he wanted truth. Renee understood that about him. She had taken something that was a softness in him and made it into a tool. I did not call Marcus. Not yet. What I did instead was invite them both to dinner. I cooked the meal Marcus had loved since childhood, pot roast with carrots and the sourdough bread that takes all day. I set the table carefully. I put out Gerald's mother's tablecloth. I lit 2 candles. They arrived at 6. And Renee was in a warm mood, the warmest I had seen in a long time. She complimented the house, the food, the tablecloth. I lifted mine and said the same. We ate. We talked. Renee brought up the Easter plan again and began to describe it in detail. She had ideas about where to go. A resort town a few hours north. Something relaxing. "You deserve a break, Dorothy," she said. "All of us do." I listened and smiled and waited. After dinner, when the plates were cleared and we were sitting with what remained of the wine, I said, "I have something I'd like to share with you both. Some things I've taken care of recently." Marcus looked up. Renee's expression did not change. I told them about the trust. I explained it calmly and factually that I had worked with an estate attorney to restructure everything, that the house was now held in a revocable living trust with specific terms, that my accounts had been updated, that everything was now properly protected and documented. "It was overdue," I said. "I should have done it years ago. I just needed the right push." Marcus said, "That sounds really smart, Mom. Good for you." Renee was very still. I looked at her, and I held her gaze for just a moment, not confrontationally, not with anger, but with the steady, clear look of a woman who has gone through her own files and found what was moved and decided to handle it herself. She looked away first. I didn't say another word about it that evening. We finished the wine and they helped carry the dishes to the kitchen, and Marcus hugged me at the door and said he'd call in the week. Renee said the dinner was wonderful. After they left, I washed the dishes by hand, the way I always do, listening to the radio. I wiped down the stovetop and folded the good tablecloth and put it away carefully. I turned off the kitchen light and walked through the dark house to my bedroom window and looked out at the rose garden. The canes were bare. Spring was still weeks away, but I had planted those roses myself, one at a time, and I knew exactly what they would do when the weather turned. Barbara called the next morning. She had become my silent partner through all of it. The person who asked the right questions and didn't tell me what to feel. I told her about the dinner, about Renee's stillness when I described the trust, about Marcus saying it sounded smart. Barbara was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Do you think he knew?" I thought about it. I thought about his face at the table, his reaction surprised, but not confused. Not guilty. "I think," I said slowly, "that he knew she was planning something, but I don't think he understood what it fully meant. I think she told him it was for everyone's benefit, and he chose to believe her because that was easier." "What are you going to do about that?" I said. "I'm going to give him the chance to choose differently." I called Marcus later that week. I didn't accuse him of anything. I told him I had made some important changes to my estate planning, and I wanted him to understand exactly what they meant and why I had made them. I told him I had done this because I love him and I want to be honest with him. I told him I was not going anywhere, that I was not planning to sell the house or move to a community or simplify anything, and that this house would still be here for him the way it had always been here for him, but that the decisions about it were mine to make and mine alone. There was a long silence. Then Marcus said, "Mom, I'm sorry." He didn't say what he was sorry for, exactly. I didn't push him to name it. What mattered was that he said it, and that his voice sounded like the voice of my son, and not the voice of a man who is reading from someone else's script. "I know," I said. "I love you." We talked for almost an hour. I won't tell you that everything was resolved after that phone call. Life is not a story where the right conversation repairs everything. Renee and I did not suddenly become close. There were dinners after that where the air between us was polite and careful and calibrated, and I accepted that. I was not looking for warmth from her anymore. I was simply looking to be clearly understood. What changed was that she understood. She understood that the paperwork she thought was in process was not in process. She understood that I had my own attorney and my own accounts and my own documentation. She understood that I had been listening and that I had been thinking, and that the version of me she had constructed in her mind, cooperative, cheerful, unaware, was not accurate. I never raised my voice. I never confronted her directly. I never told her what I had heard through the guest room door. What I did was make every relevant action she might have been planning into an action that was no longer possible, and I did it quietly and completely before she had any idea it was happening. There is a kind of power in that. I did not fully understand it until I had used it. Spring did come. The roses came back along the east fence the way they always do, red and insistent and indifferent to whatever the winter had tried to do to them. I stood at my kitchen window one morning in April and looked at them and felt something I can only describe as clarity. I think about what it cost me to be kind for so many years without condition. The $110,000. The holidays spent the way she wanted to spend them, at places she chose, around her schedule. The questions I didn't ask because I didn't want to seem difficult. The small retreats I made over and over again, in the hope that they would be recognized and returned someday. They were not returned. They were used. But here is what I also know. Being kind was not a mistake. What was a mistake was believing that being kind required me to be passive. Those are not the same thing. You can be warm and generous and still hold on to what is yours. You can love your family and still refuse to be moved from your own home. You can choose peace and still keep both eyes open. No one gets to decide when I leave this house. No one gets to rewrite the story of what I built here, what Gerald and I built together, what I have tended and maintained and kept alive on my own for 11 years since he passed. That story belongs to me. It was never available for transfer. I think sometimes about that Tuesday in February and what would have happened if I had gone on as I was. If I had smiled and answered Renee's questions and let her set up the estate attorney appointment and believed her when she said it was all for my own good, I think about how easy it would have been. She is a convincing woman. She knew exactly what tone to use with me, exactly how to frame things, exactly which of my own instincts, trust, humility, not wanting to cause trouble to work against me. She nearly succeeded. What stopped her was not luck. What stopped her was the moment I stood at that drawer and chose to believe what I was feeling instead of explaining it away. The moment I called Barbara instead of doing nothing. The moment I walked into Susan's office and put my papers on her desk and said, I need to understand my situation. Those were not dramatic moments. They didn't look like turning points from the outside. They looked like a woman going about her ordinary days. But inside each of them was a decision, and each decision led to the next. And by the time Renee sat at my table that March evening, the ground had already shifted entirely beneath her feet. She just didn't know it yet. I walk through this house now differently than I did a year ago. Not with fear, not with suspicion, but with a kind of conscious ownership that I had let go quiet over the years. I notice the yellow hallway. I notice the rose garden. I notice the kitchen window where I stand each morning with my coffee. This is mine, every ordinary inch of it, and I intend to keep it. Barbara came over last Sunday, and we sat in the backyard for most of the afternoon. The weather was warm enough to be outside, but cool enough to be comfortable, the best kind of spring day. We drank iced tea and didn't talk about any of it for hours. We talked about her granddaughter's new job and the book she was reading, and the neighbor's new dog that keeps digging under the fence. At some point, the light started going gold the way it does in late afternoon, and Barbara looked around the yard, at the roses and the old oak tree and the back of the house that I have known for 31 years, and she said, "This is a beautiful place, Dorothy." I looked at it with her. "It really is," I said. If you have someone in your life who is making you feel like your own space, your own history, your own carefully built life, is something they get to evaluate and decide the future of. I want you to hear this. You are allowed to protect what is yours without apology and without drama. You do not have to be loud about it. You do not have to accuse anyone or demand anything. You just have to be clear with yourself first about what you are seeing and what it means, and then clear in your actions, one quiet step at a time. Stillness is not the same as giving up. Patience is not the same as passivity. Sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is simply make sure that whatever they are planning quietly can no longer happen. That's what I did, and I am still here.